The frozen January wind of 1876 cut through the Nevada territory like a knife through butter, and Quinn Radcliffe had never felt lonelier in his 32 years than he did riding into Awahi that bitter afternoon, watching a woman stumble barefoot through the snow-dusted Main Street. Her feet were red and raw, bleeding in places where the frozen ground had torn the skin, and she clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders that did nothing against the brutal cold. Quinn pulled his horse to a stop, watching in horror as she fell to her knees in the middle of the street, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Without thinking, he dismounted and ran toward her, his boots crunching through the ice. "Madam," he said, dropping to one knee beside her. "What in God's name are you doing out here like this?" She looked up at him with eyes the color of summer grass, wide with fear and exhaustion. Her lips were blue, her whole body shaking violently. She tried to speak, but her teeth chattered too hard for words to form properly. Quinn did not wait for an explanation. He sat down right there in the street and yanked off his boots, his thick wool socks still warm from his body heat. "Put these on," he commanded, holding them out to her. She stared at him like he had lost his mind. "I cannot," she managed through chattering teeth. "You will freeze." "I have been cold before," Quinn said gruffly. "Put them on, now." Her hands shook so badly she could barely grip the boots. Quinn took them back and gently lifted one of her damaged feet, wincing at the sight of the cuts and frostbite beginning to set in. He slipped his sock over her foot as carefully as he could, then the boot, lacing it quickly before repeating the process with her other foot. His boots were far too large for her, but they would keep her feet off the frozen ground. Then he stood and scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She gasped in surprise, her arms instinctively wrapping around his neck. "Where are you taking me?" she asked weakly. "Somewhere warm," Quinn replied, carrying her toward the boarding house at the end of the street. His feet were already going numb in the cold, but he had endured worse during his years trailing cattle north from Texas. He kicked open the door to the boarding house, startling Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor, who looked up from her knitting with alarm. "Mercy!" the older woman exclaimed, dropping her needles. "What has happened?" "Found her in the street," Quinn said, heading straight for the fireplace in the main room. He set the woman down in the chair closest to the flames, then turned to Mrs. Henderson. "She needs hot water, blankets, and someone to look at her feet. I will pay whatever it costs." Mrs. Henderson was already moving, her maternal instincts taking over. "I will get everything." "You sit down too before you catch your death without those boots." Quinn ignored the command, instead kneeling before the woman in the chair. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 23 or 24, with delicate features and skin that had once been fair but was now reddened from exposure. There was a bruise forming on her left cheekbone, and her hands showed signs of hard labor. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Julia," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Julia Peterson." "Well, Miss Peterson, I am Quinn Radcliffe. Can you tell me what happened to you?" Julia's face crumpled, and she began to cry in earnest, great heaving sobs that shook her whole frame. Quinn felt his heart clench with an unfamiliar protectiveness. He had lived a solitary life since his parents died when he was 20, drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or form attachments. But something about this woman's suffering called to something deep within him. Mrs. Henderson returned with an armful of quilts and began wrapping them around Julia. "Hot water is coming," she said briskly. "Now then, dear, let us get those boots off and see what damage has been done." Quinn moved back to give them space, but Mrs. Henderson shot him a look. "Do not go far. I may need you." He settled into a chair nearby, watching as Mrs. Henderson carefully removed his boots and socks from Julia's feet. The damage was worse than he had thought. Her toes were white in places, red and bleeding in others. Mrs. Henderson made a disapproving sound and called for her daughter to bring the medical supplies. Over the next hour, Quinn watched as the two women worked to warm Julia's feet gradually, clean the cuts, and apply salve to the worst of the frostbite. Julia bore it all stoically, though tears continued to stream down her face. Finally, when her feet were bandaged and elevated on a cushion, Mrs. Henderson made her drink hot broth and tucked more blankets around her. "She needs rest," Mrs. Henderson told Quinn, "and she needs to stay off those feet for at least a week, maybe more." "I will pay for her room and board," Quinn said immediately. "That is generous of you, Mr. Radcliffe," Mrs. Henderson said, eyeing him speculatively. "But perhaps we should hear her story first." Quinn looked at Julia, who had stopped crying but looked utterly defeated. "Only if she is ready to tell it." Julia took a shaky breath. "I owe you that much, after your kindness. I came to Awahi 6 months ago with my husband, Robert. We were going to start a new life here. He had promised me things would be different than they were in Missouri, that he would find work and we would be happy." She paused, her hands gripping the blankets tightly. "But Robert had debts I did not know about. Gambling debts. Meng came looking for him 3 days ago. There was a fight and Robert was killed. They said I belonged to them now, that I would work off his debts. I managed to escape last night, but they took everything, even my shoes. I've been walking since then, trying to get to the next town, hoping to find help." Quinn felt rage building in his chest. "Who were these men?" "I do not know their names," Julia said quickly, fear flashing in her eyes. "Please, I do not want any trouble. I just need to leave to get far away from here." "You are not going anywhere with those feet," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "And Mr. Radcliffe, I will thank you not to go stirring up violence. This young woman needs peace and safety, not more trouble." Quinn knew she was right, but every instinct in him wanted to track down the men who had hurt Julia and make them pay. Instead, he forced himself to nod. "You are safe here," he told Julia. "I give you my word." "But I have no money," Julia protested. "I cannot pay you back." "I am not asking you to," Quinn said. "Just rest and heal. We will figure out the rest later." Mrs. Henderson helped Julia to a small room on the first floor, and Quinn finally attended to his own feet, which were painfully cold but not damaged. He pulled on his boots and sat by the fire, trying to make sense of the fierce protectiveness he felt for a woman he had just met. He had spent so many years alone, convinced he was meant for that kind of life. After his parents died of fever, he had sold their small ranch and taken to the trail, working as a hired hand wherever he could find work. He had never let himself get attached to anything or anyone, always moving on before roots could form. But something about Julia's vulnerability, her courage in the face of such hardship, had cracked something open inside him. Mrs. Henderson returned and sat down across from him. "That was a good thing you did today, Mr. Radcliffe. Any decent person would have done the same." "You would be surprised," she said dryly. "I have seen plenty of folks walk right past someone in need, and giving up your boots in the middle of winter, that takes a special kind of heart." Quinn shifted uncomfortably. He had never been good with praise. She needed them more than I did. "What are your plans now?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "I know you have been staying at the Copper Inn across town while you work at the Thornton Ranch." "I suppose I will head back there," Quinn said, though he felt reluctant to leave. "Or Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully, "I have a room here that needs some repairs. The roof leaks and the door does not hang quite right. If you were willing to fix it, I could give you the room in exchange, plus meals. That way you would be close by if Miss Peterson needs anything." Quinn looked at her sharply. "Are you matchmaking, Mrs. Henderson?" She smiled innocently. "I am simply being practical. You clearly want to make sure she is safe, and I could use the help. Besides, the copper in charges too much for that tiny room they give you." Quinn considered it. He had been planning to move on from Awahi in another week or two anyway, once he had saved enough money. But the thought of leaving Julia here, still recovering, still vulnerable to whoever had hurt her, made his stomach twist. "All right," he said. "I will take you up on that offer." Over the next few days, Quinn settled into a routine. He would wake early and work on the repairs Mrs. Henderson needed, then head to the Thornton Ranch for his regular work. In the evenings, he would return to the boarding house and share dinner with Mrs. Henderson, her daughter Margaret, and Julia when she felt strong enough to leave her room. Julia's feet were healing slowly. The frostbite had not been severe enough to cause permanent damage, but the cuts had become infected and required careful tending. Quinn made himself useful by heating water and changing bandages when Mrs. Henderson needed an extra pair of hands. Julia bore his ministrations with quiet grace, though he could see the pain in her eyes. They talked during those quiet moments, sharing pieces of their pasts. Quinn learned that Julia had grown up on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 6 children. She had married Robert when she was 19, believing his promises of adventure and a better life. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a cycle of disappointment and increasing violence as Robert's gambling addiction grew worse. "I should have left him years ago," Julia said one evening as Quinn wrapped fresh bandages around her feet. "But I kept thinking he would change, that the man I married would come back." "That is not your fault," Quinn said firmly. "A man who raises his hand to his wife is no man at all." Julia looked at him with surprise. "How did you know he hit me?" Quinn gently touched the fading bruise on her cheekbone. "I have eyes, and I have seen enough in this world to know the signs." Tears filled her eyes again, but she blinked them back. "You are a good man, Quinn Radcliffe. I do not know what I would have done if you had not found me that day." "You would have survived," Quinn said with certainty. "You are stronger than you know." As January turned to February, Julia grew stronger. She began helping Mrs. Henderson with light tasks around the boarding house, mending linens and preparing vegetables for meals. Quinn found himself looking forward to the evenings more and more, to the sound of her laugh when Margaret told a funny story, to the way her face lit up when she talked about the books she loved to read. He had never been much of a talker, but Julia drew him out in ways no one else ever had. She asked him about his childhood, about his parents, about the places he had been during his years on the trail. And she listened with genuine interest, making him feel like his stories mattered. One evening in late February, Quinn found Julia sitting alone in the parlor, staring into the fire. He had just returned from the ranch, tired and covered in dust from breaking a particularly stubborn horse. She looked up when he entered and a soft smile crossed her face. "How was your day?" she asked. "Long," Quinn admitted, sinking into the chair across from her. "But good. How are your feet?" "Much better," Julia said, wiggling her toes experimentally. "Mrs. Henderson says I should be able to walk normally again soon." Quinn felt a pang at that. Once Julia was fully healed, there would be no reason for her to stay. She would likely want to move on, to put Awahi and all its painful memories behind her. And he would go back to his solitary life on the trail, drifting from place to place with no one to come home to. "What will you do then?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Julia's smile faded. "I do not know. I have been thinking about it a lot. I cannot go back to Missouri. My family disowned me when I married Robert against their wishes, and I have no money, no skills beyond basic farm work and household tasks." "You could stay here," Quinn said before he could stop himself. "Mrs. Henderson could probably use the help permanently, and Awahi is growing. There might be other opportunities. Could I? Julia asked softly, looking at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams. Would you want me to stay? Quinn's heart hammered in his chest. He had spent years avoiding this exact moment, this vulnerability that came with admitting he cared about someone. But looking at Julia, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, he could not hide behind his usual walls. Yes, he said simply. I would want that very much. Julia stood up, moving carefully on her healing feet, and crossed to where he sat. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm. I have been so afraid to hope for anything good, she whispered, but you make me want to try again. Quinn stood, still holding her hand, and found himself closer to her than he had ever been. He could smell the lavender soap Mrs. Henderson used on the linens, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. I am not good at this, he admitted roughly. I have spent so long alone, I do not know how to be any other way. Neither do I, Julia said with a small laugh. My marriage was not exactly a model of happiness, but maybe we could figure it out together. Quinn raised his free hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over the place where the bruise had been. I would like that, he said, and then, because words had never been his strong suit, he bent down and kissed her. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a demand. Julia's hand tightened on his, and she rose on her toes to kiss him back, her other hand coming up to rest on his chest. Quinn felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a door he had kept locked for years finally swinging open. When they pulled apart, both breathing a little harder, Julia rested her forehead against his chest. I never thought I would feel this way again, she murmured. Safe, wanted. Quinn wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. You are both those things, he promised. For as long as you want to be. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms until they heard Mrs. Henderson's footsteps in the hallway. They stepped apart quickly, and Quinn could not help but smile at the flush on Julia's cheeks. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, took one look at them, and smiled knowingly. Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes, she announced. Mr. Radcliffe, you might want to wash up first. Yes, madam, Quinn said, fighting the urge to grin like a fool. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Quinn and Julia's relationship deepened. They spent their evenings talking and reading together, taking short walks around town as Julia's feet fully healed. Quinn found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, his fears and dreams and the loneliness that had plagued him for so long. Julia opened up too, about the pain of her first marriage, her hopes for a different future. But their peace was shattered one afternoon in early March when 3 men rode into town. Quinn was at the ranch when word reached him, brought by young Tommy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson who worked as a stable hand. Mr. Radcliffe, Tommy called, running toward him. Grandma sent me. She says you need to come quick. There are men asking about Miss Julia. Quinn's blood rang cold. He dropped the tools he had been using and ran for his horse, riding hard back to town. He found Mrs. Henderson standing on the porch of the boarding house, her arms crossed and her expression fierce. 3 rough-looking men sat on horses in the street, and Julia was nowhere to be seen. I told you, Mrs. Henderson was saying sharply, there is no one here by that description. We know she is here, old woman, one of the men said, his voice oily and unpleasant. Robert Peterson's widow. She belongs to us until his debts are paid. Quinn dismounted and walked up to stand beside Mrs. Henderson. The lady does not belong to anyone, he said coldly, and her husband's debts died with him. The leader of the 3 men, a scarred brute with cold eyes, looked Quinn up and down. This is none of your business, cowboy. We have a legal claim. Show me the paperwork then, Quinn said. If you have a legitimate debt, you can take it up with the territorial court, but you are not touching Miss Peterson." The man's eyes narrowed. "You are making a mistake." "The only mistake would be you not riding out of here right now," Quinn said, his hand resting casually near his gun. He had never been a violent man, had in fact avoided fights whenever possible, but he would not let these men hurt Julia. The tension stretched taut as a wire. The three men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, the leader spat into the dirt. "This is not over," he warned. "We will be back." They turned their horses and rode out of town, but Quinn knew they were not done. He waited until they were out of sight, then turned to Mrs. Henderson. "Where is she?" "In the cellar," Mrs. Henderson said, already moving toward the house. "I hid her as soon as I saw them coming." They found Julia huddled in the corner of the cellar, shaking with fear. Quinn went to her immediately, gathering her into his arms. "They are gone," he soothed. "You are safe." "They will come back," Julia said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "They always come back. Maybe I should just go with them, work off whatever Robert owed. At least then no one else would be in danger." "Absolutely not," Quinn said fiercely, pulling back to look at her. "I will not let them take you. We will find another way." "What other way?" Julia asked desperately. "I have nothing. I am nothing. Just a widow with a dead husband's debts." Quinn made a decision in that moment, one that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Marry me," he said. Julia stared at him in shock. "What? Marry me?" Quinn repeated. "As my wife, you would have legal protection. Those men could not claim you owed them anything. And I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid again." "Quinn," Julia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You cannot mean that. We have only known each other a few months." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Quinn said, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Julia Peterson. I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that street. Marry me, please." Julia looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. Then she nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Mrs. Henderson, who had been tactfully standing at the top of the cellar stairs, let out a delighted laugh. "Well then," she called down, "I suppose we have a wedding to plan." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Awahi, with Mrs. Henderson and her family as witnesses. Julia wore a dress Mrs. Henderson had altered for her, pale blue with white lace, and Quinn borrowed a proper suit from the undertaker. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, performed the ceremony with warmth and blessing. When Quinn slipped a simple gold band onto Julia's finger, a ring he had bought from the jeweler that very morning, his hand shook slightly. Julia's eyes were bright with tears as she repeated her vows, promising to love and cherish him all the days of her life. And when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed her with all the love and hope he had been holding back. That night, in the room Quinn had been renting from Mrs. Henderson, they came together as husband and wife. Quinn was gentle and patient, mindful of Julia's past trauma. He took his time, showing her with his hands and mouth and body that she was cherished, that she was safe. Julia responded with a passion that surprised them both, and afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Quinn felt a contentment he had never known. "I love you," Julia whispered into the darkness, her head resting on his chest. "I did not think I could ever say those words again and mean them, but I do. I love you, Quinn Radcliffe." Quinn tightened his arms around her. "I love you too, more than I knew it was possible to love someone." The next morning, Quinn went to the sheriff's office and reported the 3 men's threats. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Jack Morrison, listened carefully and promised to keep an eye out for trouble. He also confirmed what Quinn had hoped, that as Julia's husband, Quinn had legal standing to protect her from any claims on her dead husband's debts. "Those men sound like bounty hunters or worse," Sheriff Morrison said. "They prey on vulnerable folks, but they are cowards at heart. Now that Miss Peterson, excuse me, Mrs. Radcliffe, has a husband to protect her, they will likely move on to easier prey." Quinn wanted to believe that, but he could not shake the feeling that trouble was not done with them yet. He spent the next few weeks on high alert, his hand never far from his gun, watching for any sign of the three men. But they did not return, and slowly, Quinn began to relax. He and Julia settled into married life with surprising ease. Mrs. Henderson gave them a larger room on the second floor, and Julia threw herself into making it their own, sewing curtains and cushions, arranging their few possessions just so. Quinn continued working at the Thornton Ranch, saving every penny he could toward buying their own land someday. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's company. Julia began teaching Quinn to read better, something he had only learned the basics of as a child. He proved an eager student, delighted to discover the worlds that opened up through books. In turn, he taught her about horses and cattle, about reading the weather and the land. Spring turned to summer, and with it came news that changed everything. The Thornton Ranch was being sold. The owner, an elderly widow named Catherine Thornton, had decided to move back east to live with her daughter. She offered Quinn first right to buy the property, knowing he was a good worker and would care for the land properly. "I cannot afford it," Quinn told Julia that night, frustration evident in his voice. "Even with everything I have saved, it is not nearly enough." Julia was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What if we had partners?" she suggested. "Other families who wanted to work the land together. We could pool our resources." It was a good idea, and over the next few weeks, Quinn approached several families he knew and trusted. They formed a cooperative, with Quinn as the primary manager since he had the most experience. Together, they scraped together enough to make Mrs. Thornton an offer. She accepted, pleased to see the ranch going to good people. The day they signed the papers, Quinn could hardly believe it was real. He owned land now, had a stake in something permanent, and he had Julia by his side to share it with. That night, he took her out to the small house on the property, which would be theirs alone while the other families built their own homes nearby. "This is ours," he said, his arm around her waist as they stood on the porch watching the sunset. "Our home." Julia leaned against him, her hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that had become habitual. Quinn had noticed it over the past few weeks, along with the way she had been feeling tired and sick in the mornings. He suspected what it meant, but had been waiting for her to tell him. "Quinn," Julia said softly, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, seeing the mix of joy and nervousness in her eyes. "What is it?" "I am with child," she said, her hand pressing more firmly against her stomach. "I have suspected for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. I saw the doctor in town today, and he confirmed it. We are going to have a baby." Quinn felt his throat tighten with emotion. A baby. His child. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. He knew Julia's first marriage had been unhappy. He did not know if she had wanted children with Robert. "I am terrified," Julia admitted. "But yes, I am happy. With you I am happy." "Are you?" Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I am more than happy," he said, his voice rough. "I am blessed beyond measure. A wife I love, land of our own, and now a child. I never dreamed I would have any of this." Julia pulled back to look up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "We are going to be a family." "Yes," Quinn agreed, kissing her forehead. "A real family." The summer passed in a blur of hard work and preparation. Quinn and the other families worked to repair the ranch buildings and prepare for the fall roundup. Julia, despite the discomforts of pregnancy, threw herself into making their house a home. She sewed baby clothes from scraps of fabric, prepared and preserved food for the coming winter, and helped the other women settle into their new homes. The community they were building was unlike anything Quinn had experienced before. After so many years alone, it was strange but wonderful to have neighbors, friends, people who cared about each other's well-being. And Julia blossomed in the midst of it, her natural warmth and kindness drawing people to her. In October, as the leaves turned gold and red, 3 men rode onto the ranch. Quinn was out mending a fence when he saw them coming, and his heart sank as he recognized the leader. It was the same men who had come looking for Julia months ago. He rode to meet them, positioning himself between the men and the house where Julia was resting. "You are trespassing," he said coldly. "Turn around and leave." The scarred leader looked at him with cold amusement. "We are here on business. We have a legal claim to collect from Robert Peterson's widow." "She is not Robert Peterson's widow anymore," Quinn said. "She is Julia Radcliffe, my wife, and you have no claim on her or anything that belongs to us." "That is not how the law works," the man said, pulling out a piece of paper. "We have a contract signed by Robert Peterson, promising payment or services in lieu of his debts. His widow is bound by that contract." Quinn had feared something like this. "That contract is not legal," he said, though he had no idea if that was true. "My wife has no obligation to honor agreements made by her deceased first husband." The man's smile widened. "Then we will let the territorial court decide. We will be filing a lawsuit. You can expect a summons soon." They rode away, leaving Quinn filled with dread. He returned to the house to find Julia standing on the porch, her face pale. "I heard," she said. "Quinn, what are we going to do? We do not have money for a lawyer." "We will figure something out," Quinn promised, though he had no idea how. The next few weeks were tense and difficult. The summons arrived, just as the men had promised, naming Julia as a defendant in a debt collection suit. The court date was set for mid-November in the territorial capital. Quinn contacted every lawyer he could find, but none would take the case without a substantial retainer he could not afford. Finally, in desperation, he went to Mrs. Henderson. She listened to the whole story, then sat back with a thoughtful expression. "I know someone who might help," she said. "My nephew, Daniel Henderson. He is a lawyer in Carson City. Let me write to him." Daniel Henderson arrived 2 weeks before the court date, a serious young man with sharp eyes and a determined set to his jaw. He listened to Julia and Quinn's story, reviewed the contract the 3 men had presented, and then smiled grimly. "This is not legal," he said. "Not even close. A widow is not responsible for her husband's debts unless she co-signed for them, which you clearly did not. And this contract is so poorly written it would not hold up in any legitimate court. These men are con artists, pure and simple." Relief flooded through Quinn. "So Julia is safe?" "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "But we still need to go to court and prove it. And I need to warn you, these men might try something else if they lose. They are not the type to give up easily." The court day arrived cold and gray, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds. Quinn and Julia traveled to the territorial capital with Daniel, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of their partners. Julia was 7 months pregnant now, her belly round and prominent beneath her coat, and Quinn worried about the stress of the trial on her health. The courtroom was a plain wooden building that smelled of old paper and tobacco. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harrison Kilpatrick, listened as both sides presented their cases. The 3 men's lawyer, a slick-talking man with oiled hair, argued that Julia had a moral and legal obligation to honor her husband's debts. Daniel tore the argument apart piece by piece, citing territorial law and precedent, showing how the contract was fraudulent and unenforceable. He painted a vivid picture of Julia's suffering, of how these men had threatened and intimidated a widow, had taken her shoes and left her to freeze in the winter cold. When it was Julia's turn to testify, she spoke with quiet dignity about her first marriage, about Robert's gambling and violence, about the terrifying days after his death. Quinn saw tears in the eyes of several people in the courtroom as she described walking barefoot through the frozen streets, certain she was going to die. Then she looked at Quinn, and her voice strengthened. "But I did not die," she said. "Because this man, my husband, saw me suffering and helped me without asking for anything in return. He gave me his boots and carried me to safety. He protected me and married me and has shown me what true love and honor look like. I owe those other men nothing. Everything good in my life, I owe to Quinn." Quinn felt his eyes burning with tears. He had never heard Julia speak so publicly about her feelings, and the depth of her love and gratitude humbled him. The judge deliberated for less than an hour before returning with his verdict. "I find in favor of the defendant," he announced. "Mrs. Julia Radcliffe has no legal obligation to repay debts incurred by her deceased first husband. The contract presented by the plaintiffs is fraudulent and unenforceable. Case dismissed." Quinn felt the tension drain out of him. It was over. They had won. Julia turned to him with tears of relief streaming down her face, and he pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw. Outside the courthouse, the three men were waiting. The scarred leader stepped into their path, his face twisted with rage. "This is not over," he snarled. "You think you can just walk away? We will make you pay one way or another." "That sounds like a threat," said a new voice. Sheriff Morrison had appeared, along with two deputies, "and I do not take kindly to threats against law-abiding citizens." The man's eyes darted between the sheriff and Quinn. "We were just leaving," he muttered. "See that you do," the sheriff said. "And if I see you anywhere near Awahi or the Radcliffe Ranch, I will arrest you for harassment. Are we clear?" The men left without another word, riding off into the gray afternoon. Quinn watched them go, hoping it really was over this time. Sheriff Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. "You have got yourself a good woman there, Radcliffe. Take care of her." "I intend to," Quinn promised. They returned to the ranch to find it decorated for a celebration. The other families had prepared a feast, and that night they gathered in the large barn to celebrate the court victory and give thanks for all their blessings. Julia, glowing despite her exhaustion, laughed and talked with the other women, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Quinn stood back, watching her, and felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. A year ago, he had been alone, drifting without purpose or connection. Now he had everything that mattered: a wife he adored, a child on the way, land of his own, and a community of friends who had become like family. Winter settled in hard and cold, but the ranch was prepared. They had enough food and supplies to last until spring, and the animals were safely sheltered. Julia grew larger and moved more slowly, but her spirits remained high. She spent her days sewing and knitting, preparing for the baby's arrival in late January. Quinn hovered anxiously as her due date approached, driving her to laughter with his worrying. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him. "I will be fine." But when the pain started on a bitter cold night in late January, Quinn's anxiety proved justified. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Mrs. Henderson came to help, along with another experienced woman from a neighboring ranch. Quinn paced outside the bedroom, listening to Julia's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Finally, as dawn broke over the frozen landscape, he heard a new sound: the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy baby boy, and Julia is fine, just exhausted." Quinn rushed into the room to find Julia propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tired eyes full of wonder. "Look," she whispered. "Our son." Quinn sat carefully on the edge of the bed, gazing down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was still red and angry from his entrance into the world. But to Quinn, he was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Quinn knew exactly what felt right. "What about Thomas?" he suggested. "After the Reverend who married us, and Robert for a middle name after your first husband. He may have been a troubled man, but he was still this child's connection to you." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Robert Radcliffe," she said softly. "It is perfect. Thank you for honoring Robert's memory even after everything." "He gave me you," Quinn said simply. "For that alone, he deserves to be remembered." Little Thomas proved to be a strong, healthy baby with a powerful set of lungs. Those first few months were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and the constant demands of a newborn. But they were also filled with joy. Quinn discovered a capacity for tenderness he had not known he possessed, spending hours simply holding his son, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes. Julia blossomed as a mother, though she was often tired. She sang to Thomas in the evenings, old songs she remembered from her own childhood. Quinn would sit and listen, feeling a peace and contentment that still sometimes surprised him. Spring arrived with a rush of green growth and new calves. The ranch prospered under Quinn's careful management and the cooperative effort of all the families. They built a small schoolhouse for the children, and Julia volunteered to teach, passing on her love of reading and learning to the next generation. Thomas grew quickly, a cheerful baby who rarely cried and smiled early. By his first birthday, he was walking and getting into everything. Quinn built him a small rocking horse, and the boy would ride it for hours, making galloping sounds and squealing with delight. That summer, Julia told Quinn she was pregnant again. "Already," he said with surprise, though he could not hide his happiness. "Already," Julia confirmed, laughing at his expression. "Are you ready to do this again, with you?" "Always," Quinn said, pulling her close. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace Margaret Radcliffe, arrived the following February. The labor was easier this time, and Grace proved to be a calmer baby than her brother. She had Julia's green eyes and Quinn's dark hair, and from the beginning, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Thomas, now a curious toddler of almost 2, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would bring her his toys and pat her head gently, saying "baby" over and over. Julia and Quinn watched their children together and felt blessed beyond measure. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growing children. Quinn expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land when it became available. The cooperative grew and prospered, becoming known throughout the territory for their quality cattle and horses. Julia's school flourished, and children came from miles around to study with her. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the animals. Grace was more adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the creek. When she was 3, Julia gave birth to twins, 2 more boys they named Samuel and Joseph. The house was chaos with 4 children under 6, but it was a joyful chaos. Quinn sometimes looked around at his full, noisy house and could hardly believe this was his life. The lonely cowboy who had given his boots to a barefoot woman in the winter cold had become a husband, father, rancher, and pillar of the community. And through it all, Julia was his partner and anchor. They still had their quiet moments, usually late at night after the children were asleep. They would sit together on the porch, watching the stars and talking about their day. Quinn never tired of these moments, of the simple pleasure of being near the woman he loved. "You ever think about that day?" Julia asked him one evening when Thomas was 10 and Grace was 8, the twins running around the yard catching fireflies. "When you found me in the street?" "All the time," Quinn admitted. "It was the luckiest day of my life." "Mine too," Julia said softly. "I was so certain I was going to die. Everything hurt and I was so cold and afraid. And then there you were, this stranger who looked at me with such kindness. You gave me your boots, Quinn. Your own boots in the middle of winter." "I could not stand to see you suffering," Quinn said. "From that first moment I felt like I was meant to find you to protect you." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved my life that day, but more than that, you gave me a reason to live. You showed me what love could really be. Not ownership or control, but partnership and respect and tenderness." Quinn kissed the top of her head. "You saved me too," he said. "I was so alone before you. I thought I was fine with that, but I was not. I was just surviving, not living. You taught me how to truly live." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play. Thomas was showing the twins how to catch the fireflies gently and then let them go. Grace was making up stories about where the fireflies lived and what adventures they had. "We made a good life together," Julia said eventually. "A beautiful life." "We did," Quinn agreed. "And we are not done yet. We have many years ahead of us still." As the children grew older, Quinn began teaching Thomas the ins and outs of running the ranch. The boy took to it naturally, showing the same patience with animals that his father had. Grace surprised everyone by developing a talent for healing, and by the time she was 12, she was assisting the doctor in town, learning about medicine and surgery. The twins were inseparable, always inventing games and getting into mischief. Samuel was the quieter of the two, thoughtful and observant like Thomas. Joseph was the showman, always performing and making people laugh. When Thomas turned 16, Quinn gave him his first real responsibility, managing the spring roundup. Julia worried, but Quinn had faith in his son. Thomas proved more than capable, handling the complex logistics with maturity beyond his years. That same year, Grace announced she wanted to go to medical school back east. It was almost unheard of for a woman, but Julia supported her dream fiercely. "If anyone can do it, you can," she told her daughter. Quinn was less certain. The thought of his little girl going so far away made his heart ache, but he could not deny her the opportunity to pursue her passion. They spent months preparing, saving money, and writing to schools. Finally, Grace was accepted to a women's medical college in Pennsylvania. The day she left was one of the hardest of Quinn's life. He held his daughter close, trying to memorize the feel of her in his arms. "You write to us every week," he commanded, his voice gruff with emotion. "I will, Papa," Grace promised, tears streaming down her face. "I will make you proud." "You already have," Quinn said. "Every single day of your life." After Grace left, the house felt emptier, though Thomas and the twins still kept it lively. Julia threw herself into her teaching and Quinn focused on the ranch. They wrote to Grace faithfully, and her letters back were full of excitement about her studies and the fascinating world she was discovering. Thomas, at 18, began courting a sweet girl named Elizabeth from a neighboring ranch. Julia approved, seeing in Elizabeth the same quiet strength and kindness she valued. The wedding took place the following spring, a joyful celebration that brought together families from across the territory. Quinn walked his son's bride down the aisle, as her own father had passed away the previous winter. Watching Thomas marry reminded him of his own wedding day, the fear and hope he had felt. He caught Julia's eye across the church and saw her wiping away happy tears. Grace came home for the wedding, bringing with her stories of her studies and the surgery she had observed. She had grown into a confident young woman, though she was still their little girl at heart. "I am learning so much, Papa," she told Quinn, "but I miss home. I miss all of you." "We miss you too," Quinn said, "but we are so proud of what you are doing." The twins, now 14, were beginning to think about their own futures. Samuel wanted to study law, inspired by Daniel Henderson's defense of their mother all those years ago. Joseph dreamed of becoming an actor, much to Julia's amusement and Quinn's bewilderment. As Quinn approached his 50s, he began to slow down a bit, letting Thomas take on more of the ranch responsibilities. He spent more time with Julia, taking long rides together like they had when they were courting. They would pack a lunch and spend the day exploring the land they had built their life on. "You have any regrets?" Julia asked him one afternoon as they sat by a creek, watching the water flow past. They were both graying now, their faces lined with age and experience, but to Quinn, Julia was as beautiful as she had been that winter day when he first saw her. "Not a single one," Quinn said honestly. "Every choice I made, every path I took led me to you. How could I regret that?" Julia smiled and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I used to think my life was over after Robert died. I was so certain I had nothing left to live for, but I was wrong. My real life did not start until I met you." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had weathered storms and built something lasting together. Their children were grown or growing, finding their own paths in the world. The ranch was thriving, a legacy they would pass on to future generations. And through it all, their love had only deepened and grown stronger. Grace finished medical school at the top of her class and returned to Nevada to practice, opening a clinic in Awahi. She married a fellow doctor, a kind man named Peter Richardson, and they had 3 children of their own. Quinn delighted in being a grandfather, spoiling his grandchildren in ways he had never indulged his own children. Thomas and Elizabeth also had children, 4 in total, and they took over the main running of the ranch. Quinn was happy to step back, to spend his days doing lighter work and enjoying time with Julia and their growing family. Samuel did become a lawyer, following in Daniel Henderson's footsteps. He practiced in Carson City, defending those who could not afford representation, carrying on the legacy of justice and fairness. Joseph surprised everyone by becoming quite successful in San Francisco, performing in theaters and eventually directing productions. When Quinn turned 60, the family gathered for a massive celebration. All 4 of his children were there, along with their spouses and children. The ranch house, expanded over the years, was full to bursting with laughter and love. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Quinn and Julia sat on their porch one more time. 60 years old, Quinn mused. "I never thought I would live to see this age." "You will live many more years yet," Julia said confidently. "We both will. We have grandchildren to watch grow up, maybe even great-grandchildren someday." "I hope so," Quinn said, "because I am not ready to leave this life, not ready to leave you." Julia squeezed his hand. "We have been blessed, Quinn, so incredibly blessed. Sometimes I still cannot believe it is all real." "It is real," Quinn assured her. "Every beautiful, messy, wonderful moment of it." As the years continued to pass, Quinn and Julia settled into a peaceful routine. They took walks every morning, weather permitting, moving more slowly than they once had but still enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. They read to each other in the evenings, attended church on Sundays, and spoiled their grandchildren shamelessly. Thomas ran the ranch with the same care and dedication Quinn had always shown. Grace's medical practice flourished, and she became known throughout the territory for her skill and compassion. Samuel made a name for himself in the legal world, and Joseph's theater company became one of the most respected in California. When Quinn was 68 and Julia 63, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. The family gathered again, now including 11 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Grace organized the celebration, decorating the ranch house with flowers and ribbons. During the dinner, Thomas stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught us what true love looks like, not just in the grand gestures, though Papa certainly made his share of those, but in the daily choice to be kind, to be patient, to be faithful. You showed us that a strong marriage is built on respect and partnership and genuine friendship. Thank you for that example. Thank you for building this family and this legacy. We love you both more than words can say." Quinn looked around the table at his children and grandchildren, all these lives that had sprung from that one choice to help a barefoot woman in the winter. He thought about the lonely cowboy he had been, certain he was meant to wander alone forever. And he thought about the grace that had brought Julia into his life, changing everything. "I want to say something too," Quinn said, standing slowly. Julia looked up at him in surprise. "I have never been much of a speaker, as you all know, but there are some things that need to be said. 40 years ago, I married the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. She was brave and kind and strong, and she took a chance on a rough cowboy who had nothing to offer but his love. Julia, you made me a better man. You gave me purpose and meaning and a family I never dreamed I could have. Every day with you has been a gift, and I would not trade a single moment of our life together." He looked around at his children. "And you 4, you are my greatest pride and joy. Watching you grow and become who you are meant to be has been the honor of my life. I hope you know how much your mother and I love you, how proud we are of the people you have become." There was not a dry eye in the room when Quinn sat down. Julia leaned over and kissed him softly. "I love you," she whispered. "Today and always." "Today and always," Quinn echoed, holding her hand. The celebration lasted well into the night, filled with music and laughter and stories. The grandchildren begged Quinn to tell again the story of how he and Julia met, and he obliged, watching Julia's face as he described finding her in the frozen street, giving her his boots, carrying her to safety. It was a story they never tired of hearing, a reminder of where their family had begun. As the years advanced, Quinn's health began to decline. He developed a cough that would not go away, and his energy was not what it had been. Grace examined him and prescribed rest and medicine, but they all knew he was simply getting old. Julia, meanwhile, remained remarkably healthy, still teaching a few students and tending her garden. She fussed over Quinn constantly, making sure he ate and rested and took his medicine. He grumbled about being treated like an invalid, but secretly he loved her attention. One evening in early winter, when Quinn was 73, he and Julia sat by the fire as they had done thousands of times before. Snow was falling outside, soft and white, coating everything in silence. Quinn watched the flakes drift past the window and thought about that winter day so long ago when he had found his reason for living. "Julia," he said softly. "Yes, my love," she answered, looking up from her sewing. "If I could go back and live my life over, knowing everything that would happen, all the hardships and struggles, I would not change a single thing. Because it all led me to you, to this life we built together. You are my greatest blessing." Julia set down her sewing and came to sit beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. "You gave me my boots when I had none," she said, echoing words she had said countless times over the years. You carried me home when I could not walk. You showed me what it meant to be truly loved. You are my hero, Quinn Radcliffe. You always have been. They sat together, hands clasped, watching the snow fall. And in that moment, surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had raised, and the love they had nurtured for over 4 decades, Quinn felt complete. Quinn lived for another 5 years, long enough to see 2 more great-grandchildren born, and to celebrate his and Julia's 45th anniversary. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep at age 78, Julia was holding his hand, as she had held it through all the joys and sorrows of their life together. The funeral was attended by people from all over the territory, a testament to the impact Quinn had made. But it was Julia's eulogy that brought everyone to tears. Standing beside his coffin, her voice strong despite her grief, she told the story one more time of the lonely cowboy who had given his boots to a barefoot woman in winter and changed both their lives forever. "He was my partner, my best friend, my great love," Julia said. "And though my heart is broken by his loss, I am grateful beyond measure for every day we had together. He taught me that it is never too late for a new beginning, that kindness and courage can change everything, and that true love is the greatest adventure of all." Julia lived for 10 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She never remarried, saying that she had been blessed with the great love of her life and needed no other. She spent her remaining years teaching, tending her garden, and sharing stories of Quinn with anyone who would listen. When Julia passed at age 83, she was laid to rest beside Quinn under a spreading oak tree on the ranch they had built together. Their headstone bore a simple inscription that their children had chosen: Quinn and Julia Radcliffe, united in life, united in death. Their love was their legacy. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management and eventually passed to his children. Grace's clinic became a hospital, serving the growing community for generations. Samuel's legal practice established precedents that protected vulnerable people throughout the territory. And Joseph's theater company brought joy and culture to thousands. But it was the story that became their true legacy. The story of a barefoot woman in winter, and the lonely cowboy who gave her his boots and carried her home. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, a reminder that a single act of kindness can change the course of a life, that love can bloom even in the hardest circumstances, and that the greatest riches come not from what we possess, but from what we give away. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on the ranch, working the land and raising cattle just as Quinn did. And on winter evenings, when snow falls soft and white over the Nevada territory, they tell the story to their own children. The story of how their family began with one man's compassion and one woman's courage, and how that moment of grace rippled forward through time, creating a legacy of love that would endure for generations. The boots Quinn gave Julia that frozen January day were preserved and passed down through the family, a tangible reminder of where it all began. They sit now in a place of honor in the ranch house, worn and weathered but still whole, symbols of the sacrifice and love that founded a dynasty. And in the quiet moments, when the winter wind howls around the old house and the fire crackles in the hearth, it is easy to imagine 2 figures sitting close together, hands clasped, watching the snow fall. The lonely cowboy and the barefoot woman who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would last forever. Their story reminds us all that we are never too lost to be found, never too broken to be healed, never too alone to find love. It teaches us that the smallest acts of kindness can have the greatest consequences, that courage comes in many forms, and that the measure of a life is not in what we accumulate, but but in the love we share and the lives we touch. Quinn and Julia Radcliffe lived and died, as all people must. But their love, their legacy, and their story live on, passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, from friend to friend. A testament to the enduring power of compassion, the transformative nature of love, and the truth that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest choice. To see someone in need and offer help without expecting anything in return. The barefoot woman found her home. The lonely cowboy found his purpose. And together, they found everything that truly matters in this world: love, family, belonging, and a legacy that would endure long after their footsteps faded from the earth.